Hello, and welcome to our fifth lecture in this class series dealing with pre-global Buddhism. I want to discuss a little bit more with you today the great circle of Buddhism, as we've talked about before, and the fact that the rim of it, that is the outermost appearance of Buddhism, remains or artifacts that occurred through the area which we call, or has been called, the Silk Road, was in some cases a very narrow strip of Buddhist activity. The rim of Buddhism at some points in the Tarim Basin was basically a trail, and at other places was an oasis type city-state, which had no real development beyond it. So we're looking at part of the rim. And this rim was enormously important to the history of Buddhism. As small as it was in places, it still was the route through which Buddhism first made its way to the Chinese capital. So let's go back and look at the map as Buddhism begins the process of leaving the subcontinent. We've already discussed that when Ashoka's grandfather had negotiated to control those parts of what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, when he got control of those areas, it meant that that region through which Buddhism had to pass in order to get around the Himalayas and make its way into Inner Asia was oriented toward India and was not oriented toward the Persians. It was Gandhara in that region where we find some of the most important and developing aspects of Buddhism as it made its way toward China. As you can see from the map, Gandhara is located right up there where the mountain range, the Himalayas, and the whole of Afghanistan mountainous area narrow, and there is that pass which allows you to go across and thereby circumvent the high mountains for trade and other things. It was just at the headwaters of the Indus River, and it was an area that had been controlled by many empires. Of great interest to us is the fact that, of course, it was oriented toward the Greek culture. Soldiers, the mercenaries left from Alexander, the mercenaries that were tied to the Eastern Parthian Empire, gave this area a cosmopolitan development, which is not found in many other places. Now, the question is, what kind of Buddhism passed through here? Was Buddhism changed as it passed through the region? So we are still searching for the answers to these questions. One of the places that we can look to give us some hints is Bamiyan. Now, Bamiyan, of course, became very popular. I shouldn't say popular, but very famous in the news because of the Taliban destroying these large images. But this stretch of a rock face at Bamiyan allowed the locals to carve out of the stone gigantic Buddha images. Why so big? What was there that led the Buddhists to make these colossal Buddha images? We're not so sure about the kind of Buddhism which was there yet. We're making scholars are making advances. The earliest literature that or textual sources that we can find indicate that there was great interest in Avadanas or Jataka tales, the stories of the former life of the Buddha, and that these colossal images would indicate that people saw the Buddha not so much as an ordinary human, but as a majestic divinity. And that would be supported in part by some of the Jataka tales, which were filled with miraculous things, miraculous stories. So the passage of Buddhism through here, first of all, I think that one of the things the Greeks gave to Buddhism, the Greeks in this area, was portrait imagery. And that the Buddha image and the fact that you find these huge Buddha images is how important the image became in Buddhism, has many of its roots right here in Gandhara. The relic cult is almost left behind as you see these mammoth Buddha images which dominate the horizon. Now, the colossal imagery was also present in the contemporary religious tradition of the Jain. The Jain tradition had enormous images of their founder, Jina. So that when you see enormous Buddha images, they are similar, except as you can tell here, in one respect. Jina is always nude. The Buddha is always draped. The Jina is nude because he has achieved a state in which there is no need to have identification, to have cover his body. There's no shame. He is completely a divine creature, much like the Greek gods. Greek gods were always nude. When you put dress on something, when you make an image with clothing, then you identify caste, you identify status. But when you remove all clothing, it's as if you have stripped away all the things which separate people and it is just the human body. But the human body made huge, the human body made divine, the human body made colossal. So we need to look at all of this as we try to figure out what kind of Buddhism passed through these regions. One of the things that we do know is that as it passed through, they translated the Buddhist texts into Gandhari. I think that's a very significant finding that scholars have come up with in recent years, that not only did they maintain a kind of the Prakrit form of Buddhism that you find in Pali and in Middle Indic, but they translated it into their local language. And nowadays, there's a question. When Buddhism went on into China, what kind of texts did people take with them? Did they take Sanskrit text? They may have taken texts in Gandhari instead. Those were the texts which we find most ancient, some of the most ancient manuscript finds that we have from birch bark, which would have been the writing surface for that area because they didn't have the palms of the tropical portions of India. These birch barks have been found, uncovered. They're very hard to work with. They are so fragile, almost a breath of air, and they just disintegrate into dust because they are almost 2,000 years old. So that tells us that perhaps the people who went into China carried with them the Gandhari texts. The other thing which we find there are coins. Coins with the portraitures of the ruler on one side and a deity on the reverse side of the coin. It is possible that the first Buddha image was on a coin, on the back side of a coin, coming from this region. So a lot was happening there: text, art, and doctrine. The Sarvastivada tradition, not just Mahayana, not just early Buddhism, but the later development of textual studies and commentaries are also found in this region. From there, once you've passed through this very rich cultural area, then the question is, how do you make it, even if you're just circling around the mountains? These mountains are so huge, and the Indus River rising in the Himalayas, if you follow the Indus River, then which bank are you on? Because once you're on one side or the other of the river, as you go into the higher reaches, it's extremely difficult to cross. That's why I've suggested that we should have embankment studies, because the culture on one side of the river can be very different than the culture on the other side if there are no bridges. We have the story of one of the Chinese pilgrims. As he came, Faxian, as he came through here, he says that he had to climb down 700 steps cut in the rock face down to where the river was rushing, and there was only a rope across it, and you had to be pulled across on the rope. In parts of the Himalayas, this is still what you have to do to get across. There are still places where there are no bridges. You have this kind of rope, wire, bridges that are made out of cables that are pulled across the rivers. So it was still a huge task to travel on beyond there and work your way toward China. And you can understand that you couldn't take animals and cross this river. You just couldn't do it very easily. So as we follow the track of the rim of the great circle of Buddhism through these mountains, it was not a wonderfully easy route that people took. Finally, if you got up to the high passes, then of course there was snow, cold in the winter, icy storms, frozen lakes at times. And a high altitude, high enough to make you sick if you weren't careful. The big issue was when you get up into these higher altitudes, it's very hard for there to be permanent residents, farming, people who have food. You've got to carry it with you. And that's still the case in part of the Himalayas. You just can't go walking into some of the mountain areas and expect people to have food that you can buy. It's not there. They can't afford, their very life depends on keeping a food supply for themselves. So you have to carry all your food, all your sustenance with you. Again, a major, major problem. So that's why when we were talking in our Q&A, when you talk about someone going from one place to another, the chance that an individual could do it on their own without help from some kind of system of travel is very, very difficult to conceive. It was the merchants who knew how to travel, how to carry all their food stuff, how to make it over these high passes. And so that's one of the reasons why Buddhism winds up being so dependent on the mercantile class as it moves through areas like this. Now, once you're over the mountain on this circle, then the Buddhists faced the exact opposite. A barren desert that's as barren as any desert on the face of the earth. A desert that sinks to below sea level. A deep depression. And this depression is sometimes so dry that it is said that maybe in certain areas, there's no proof that rain has hit the ground for 800 years. It rains and just evaporates before it hits the ground. So people, in order to get around this, had to divide. You could go north or south. And so we have the issue of whether or not Buddhism was influenced by the fact that there was the northern road around this, and there was a southern road. The southern road would be dominant by Khotan, and the northern road was more with Kucha. As you went around this road, of course, the Buddhist sites were oases. The merchants had to get around it, and they managed to do so. One of the ways in which people handle these difficult places, particularly hot, dry, cold in the winter, freezing, is to go underground. So caves were developed, like the caves at Kizil. Today, the local people have built a statue to Kumarajiva, one of the most famous translators who went from Kashmir along this route, this northern route around the desert, going to China, where he would become a almost co-leader with the emperor. He was so important, he was so famous. And so his image is appropriately put, I think, in front of these caves. If you'll notice as you travel through these regions, one of the things that I think tells you something about what kind of control people had on the areas is how difficult was it to get up to and into the caves. At Kizil, they are high on the cliffs. You would have to have a ladder, you would have to have a rope hung down for you to get up to them. I think that's because there was just no support or security forces to protect you when you were there. You're on your own. And trading routes always attract pirates, they attract robbers. So in order to have protection, what the merchants looked for was a place that they could stop that was high up on a cliff, and they could be protected and not be in great danger. Now, we don't know how much Buddhism changed as it moved through this area. These caves were built by the merchants. They were a form of merit making for merchants. Were there sufficient residential monastics in all of these places to really change Buddhist doctrine by discussion, by debate? Or were these just way stations where people stopped and then went on? And the Buddhism that enters part of this route is the Buddhism which emerges at the other end. It has not been significantly shifted by its transit through such regions as this. At Kizil, the paintings are really wonderful, and they have Bukharians. They have the local people from that area that we've talked about, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They had contact with merchants from many places to the West. And they represented this on their paintings that they have. So the paintings tell us something about the Buddhist tradition. And we know that there was activity and there were people there who were trained and who were teaching the tradition. The farther you go toward the north and east, as you go closer to the Great Desert and the Great Tarim Basin, I think the less chance there was that Buddhism was undergoing any kind of real change as it passed through. You can see at the map here that if you went by the southern route and you went by the northern route, at the eastern end of the Tarim Basin, the two roads met. And that's where Dunhuang is. The power of Dunhuang is its strategic location, located where the two routes met. There are over 400 caves that have been dug into the cliff at Dunhuang. Not all of them are wonderful. Some are just a hole in the wall, but others are highly decorated. They are some of the most beautiful folk art that you can find. You can see here the image of a hunt. The hunters are out, horses, the flow of it, the artistic vision that you see in this ceiling. You also see at the very bottom of the painting, one of the riders in black is riding and shooting backwards. This is called the Parthian shot. Parthian shot was that in order to keep the prey from running away from you, you get it to chase after you. And then as it chases after you, which is the instinct of many wild animals, if you run, they'll come after you, is to then turn in your saddle and shoot your arrows. We still have it. If somebody walks out the door and just as they go out the door, they turn and make a nasty comment, we call that a parting shot. This is an image of where that comes from, the Parthian shot. So we see the Buddhism moving along this rim all the way to Dunhuang. Difficult still. It's an area that's filled with a number of problems, an area where people still live in caves out of choice. It's a lot more comfortable to have your house as a cave through the hot summer and the cold winters, and to try to build a house and insulate it. So cave dwellings are quite a reasonable approach to handle life at this point. When you travel this region, it's possible now, as you can see, to do it by train. Sometimes we fly, and in a few cases, you can actually use a bus. Most of us who've traveled here, you could go by train from Beijing to Dunhuang or near it, or you can fly in. As you go along through Turfan, you're just passing one ruined city after another. And these are amazing places because many of them have never had archaeological digs. It's only local people or others that dig up a few things once in a while. But these were sizable city-states. And today they're all in ruins. So sometimes people say, well, what happened to Buddhism on the Silk Road? Why did it give way and why did it disappear? What was wrong with Buddhism that it couldn't survive? Buddhism is people. And if the population disappears, there's no Buddhism. It's not that Buddhism fails. There just aren't any people to practice it. These towns that you see were totally dependent on the trade that passed through them. And as long as that trade was really functioning, there was wealth, there was prosperity. But as you can see, if you move beyond these, you don't see any signs of much life out there in the desert and in the mountains. It was centered just on the trade route, the trade track. I like to compare these to, in the US, our interstate highways. If you travel an interstate highway in parts of Utah or even Western Nebraska, you have large, long stretches where there's almost no population. And yet you come across a rest stop. And it has gasoline, motels, restaurants, in some cases, casinos. It's a thriving little spot along these highways that go between barren areas that stretch for miles. Now, those rest stops, those supply centers, those motels and gas stations were not built for local people. They could not survive on local traffic. The only way they can survive is to be in a strategic location where there is a flow of traffic that's traveling long distance and needs the services. They're service centers. That's what these city-states were in many ways. They could survive, they could have money, they could deal with life, but if you cut off the trade, if people decide to do another route, then they just fall into decay. The example in the US is Highway 66. It used to stretch from Los Angeles to Chicago. It was a 2-lane road for years and years. Very dangerous travel, but it was the main route. And people wrote songs about it, and there's nostalgia about what Highway 66 was once like. Then came the interstates. And many places, Highway 66 is just practically, there's nothing there. You can see an old service station, an old gasoline station, or not. And it was like this Silk Road towns. We have this all along Route 66 where the interstate freeway just destroyed its commercial and its reason for being. So if you want, you can take a nostalgia trip They take buses and take you on part of Highway 66, and you can travel the old route. Those of us who actually made a trip on Highway 66 at one time, that's how old I am. It is kind of nice to see what it was once like. So that's how I look at what I see out here in these deserted ruins, one spot after another across the desert. And some of it is very impressive. They didn't have trees. They didn't even have stone. The only construction they could have was rammed earth. But look at these huge rammed earth walls that still exist from the time when this was a walled city. And you would think that rammed earth would not survive for so long. But if you do it right, rammed earth is like almost like concrete. You wouldn't want to have a steady stream of water hit it, but you can build a house, and people do that still, particularly in California. They build rammed earth houses, beautiful. If the local soil is red or brown or whatever color it is, and that's the color of your house. So I like this picture at the bottom. When I first drove across in a bus in this area, there was a donkey pulling a cart way out in the middle of the desert, and there wasn't a town or a living person within sight. And I kind of think that it's this cart that I saw this cart. I believe I did. It looks so familiar to me that you could see these people. I have no idea where they were going, what they were doing way out there by themselves. But in the past, you would have seen a steady stream of caravans, camels, horses. They were carrying trade from the western coastline of India all the way into China. So what I've been trying to do today is just to say to you, Buddhism passed through mountains, it passed through deserts, and sometimes it picked up a lot of cultural features, such as portrait images, language, cultural patterns, and other times when it just passed through a region where there was not a crucial mass of human beings to make any changes while it passed along. So this Silk Road is still very romantic. We all think about it. I've enjoyed traveling along it. It's fascinating, difficult. But I think that when we see how Buddhism made its way to China, it leaves us almost breathless to understand how such a large cultural transfer could take place in this manner, in this kind of region, with these kind of physical difficulties. We have merchants to thank. We have monastics who were willing, monks who were willing to travel with the merchants to thank for the spread of Buddhism. And we need to understand just how difficult it was. So that's why I've said Buddhism could only do this because there was a system in place that could support it, and support it to the degree that it could have a chance to either just pass through or to settle down and become a local tradition. But however you look at it, just keep in mind, Buddhism is people, and it only exists where there are people. Thank you very much.